Good evening or afternoon, whatever the case may be for you, from the East Coast to Hawaii. My name is Helen Zia, and on behalf of the Dartmouth Asian Pacific American Alumni Association and the nonprofit organization Stop Repeating History, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event to discuss the current resurgence of anti-Asian hate and violence and what we can do to address it. As an initial matter, let me acknowledge and thank the co-sponsors of this event, which is the first time, though hopefully not the last, we all come together like this. The Asian American Alumni Associations representing almost every other Ivy League school, Brown, Cornell, Harvard, Penn, Princeton, and Yale, plus those of Duke and Stanford, and also from within the Dartmouth family, the Dartmouth Consortium of Studies in Race, Migration, and Sexuality, along with Dartmouth affiliated groups, the Black Alumni of Dartmouth Association, the Dartmouth Association of Latino Alumni, the Dartmouth LGBTQI+ Alumni Association, the Native American Alumni Association of Dartmouth, and the Women of Dartmouth. Before we go any further, let me also take a moment to recognize that today, coincidentally, is the first anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, which serves as a reminder of, among many other things, the tremendous debt of gratitude we all owe the Black Lives Matter movement for creating what may be an inflection point that gives hope that changing systemic racism is possible in this country at this time. And to the Black community as a whole for its long history of struggle for equality and civil rights that have benefited all of us people of color. I suspect our panelists will have a lot more to say about this later. That said, the idea for this event obviously began in response to the anti-Asian hate and violence that seemed to explode since the pandemic began over a year ago. And while we hope control of that pandemic itself is close at hand, the resurgence and recurrence of anti-Asian hate sadly is not. As you will no doubt hear from our extraordinary panelists, this is not a new one-off problem. And it's clearly a threat to anyone who looks Asian, and it doesn't differentiate on the basis of country of ancestry, wealth, status, class, or standing as an American. Although seniors and especially women have been mostly targeted, and the thousands who have been assaulted over the past year could have been our parents, spouses, daughters, if not ourselves. This event was based upon a simple premise. To those whom much is given, such as an elite education, much is expected. We all should be thinking about what and how we can change the climate of racist hate and violence in our country. And it isn't just about Asians. Anti-Semitism continues to rear its ugly head as well, and the news of yesterday's reprehensible attacks on Jewish folks is a sobering reminder of how pernicious and widespread hate is, and how large the challenges that we face. Anyway, let us begin by introducing our panel's moderator, Michelle Yi Lee. Michelle's a star national reporter with, though starting this August, the incoming Tokyo bureau chief for the Washington Post. She has written numerous articles and conducted many interviews with Asian community leaders on this crisis. In her spare time, she's the president of the Asian American Journalists Association, which has a worldwide membership of over 1,500 journalists and is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. We are grateful to have her leading this discussion. So Michelle, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Hoyt. And thank you all for joining us. I'm really honored and humbled to be a part of this discussion. So first, I would like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Helen Zia, activist, author, journalist, and key figure in the Asian American Civil Rights Movement. Helen is a graduate of Princeton and also longtime AAPI. Welcome. Ambassador Gary Locke, the first Chinese American governor in US history, former US Secretary of Commerce, and former ambassador to China during the Obama administration. And the ambassador is a graduate of Yale and Boston University. And we have Neal Katyal, former Acting Solicitor General of the United States, who has argued more Supreme Court cases in US history than has any minority attorney, and he is a graduate of Dartmouth and Yale. So welcome everyone, excited to have you. And those in the audience, please make sure to add your questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat box, and we'll monitor it throughout the talk. So we have a lot to cover. First, let's start with some big overviews of the key issues that we're facing here. Helen, let's start with you. You were the national organizer and spokesperson for the Justice for Vincent Chin campaign, and you've been a leading activist. Give us a brief overview of what happened at the time of the murder of Vincent Chin and the progression of the AAPI civil rights movement in its aftermath.
Well, sure, Michelle, and just thanks to you and all of the organizers here for putting this event together. And on such a day where when we talk about anti-Asian hate and what we can do about it, we remember the murder of George Floyd and the long journey that all of us have been going through. And I think one of the notable things of this year and a half that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have been fighting this anti-Asian hate ever since the coronavirus was first identified in China in December 2019. One of the things that we all had to deal with was people saying things like, oh, so you Asian Americans experience racism, or even if they just said hate, not even the R word, that we've had to answer, well, actually, no, we are not just experiencing this now. This is a pattern of the history we've experienced from the day one that Asian Americans have stepped onto this continent, which actually we can date back to hundreds of years, not just into the 1800s. And, so we've had to answer that no, this might be new to you. It is not new to us. And it's heartbreaking that it's taken a mass killing in Atlanta of Asian businesses, Asian spas that were sought after and hunted down to kill 8 people, including 6 Asian American women, that was soon after followed by another mass killing in Indianapolis, where Sikh Americans were hunted down. And so this is what it's taken to kind of wake up other people to recognize what it is that Asian Americans have been experiencing, not just through this pandemic, but for a very long time. And, we can trace this back, we can talk about the ethnic cleansing period of the 1800s. We can talk about that was the driving out period that was then extended through the Page Act that was to bar Chinese women out of the country, followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act that was to bar Chinese from becoming American citizens and entering the country, that was then extended to the Asiatic Exclusion Acts that covered all Asians, yellow and brown, to not be allowed to be part of this American democracy. And those are some of the patterns that we've seen over and over again. The incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans. And I know that Stop Repeating History is one of the idea for this event. But we see that, unfortunately, history often repeats itself. And in the most current contemporary times, one of the events that's been cited over and over again has been the 1982 killing of Vincent Chin in Detroit, Michigan. And I happened to be in Detroit then, where I went after my Ivy League education to become an auto worker in a Chrysler stamping plant, where I was a large press operator and had been working to learn something about social change in the heartland of America. And while I was there, I got laid off along with millions of other workers as the manufacturing sector of America collapsed. And what that was another time of crisis, very parallel to what we are experiencing today. And if we go back to the 1800s, it seems like every time there was an economic crisis, who got targeted and blamed for that? Well, Asian Americans of different stripes were singled out, and then there were massacres and lynchings and killings. And so in this 1982, when a young man named Vincent Chin, who many of you know the story, was at his bachelor party, about to get married, in the middle of the 3rd year of that economic crisis that began with an oil embargo. And that's what led to the collapse of the auto industry. Well, by the 3rd year of an economic crisis, and here we are in really the end of the first year of what's happened globally. But if we can imagine this 2 more years of people out of work, suffering, in misery, not knowing where their futures were ever going to go, that's what it was like in Detroit and much of the rest of the country. And even though it was an oil crisis that was happening in the Middle East, Japan got blamed. And why was that? Because Japan made fuel efficient cars. And I'd like to point out, so did Germany. But racism is so much more effective when people look different. And so Japan was labeled as the enemy. There was intense Japan bashing constantly. And what that meant, we as Asian Americans know that we get lumped together. And so that night, one of those nights in that period, a young man named Vincent Chen, a Chinese American, was, seated across 2 white auto workers at his bachelor party. And the 2 white auto workers looked at him and said, "It's because of you mother F's that we're out of work." And then they proceeded to chase him, stalk him through the streets of Detroit. And at some point hired a guy and said, "We're going to get the Chinese." And when they found him, they beat his head into the, with a baseball bat. And so that would have been tragic enough. But what prompted the movement that then came out of that was the fact that the 2 white killers in a city like Detroit, when they were up for sentencing, and it had been witnessed by, dozens of people, so there was no question that they had done it. When they were sentenced, the judge took one look at these now clean-cut looking white killers and said, "Oh, you're not the kind of men who should go to jail," and then promptly gave them probation. And so we saw there a huge outcry, and the Asian American community came together really for the first time to stand up and say, we have a stake in the civil rights of America, and join together as Asian Americans and with other communities of color to really start a civil rights movement with Asian Americans at the center. But what is parallel with today is it is, China is the enemy. China is the cause of all the problems and woes that, is being blamed for that. And so the scapegoating continues today, where it's instead of, Japan bashing, it's China bashing, but we see that that's extended really to all, yellow and brown Asian Americans being potential targets. So there are a lot of parallels, but what I'd like to say is the lesson we should take from that is the movement that came out to stand up and to link arms with other communities, to join together within our own communities, and to be part of the movements for justice, the calls for ending systemic racism, examining the need for institutional change, and really for Asian Americans and those who are on this in this audience who have had the privilege of getting a fine education, of doing something with that. And so I'll stop there, but there are a lot of other lessons to be learned from that.
Yes. Well, thank you for that overview. I think you touched on a lot of topics we'd love to delve more into, and as well as, what I would like to ask the other panelists about next. Neal, can you tell us?
I'm not sure.
Sorry, that's my Alexa. There's a lot of debate over how and when to label an incident a hate crime or a hate incident. We're already seeing this from Atlanta. Neal, can you tell us about the legalities surrounding reporting and labeling hate crimes and what limitations the community is facing because of those legalities? And then I'm going to go unplug my Alexa real quickly.
Sure. It's a real delight and privilege to be here with you and the other panelists. And, I'll start with your narrow question and then get a little bit broader. So kind of the reverse of what Helen did. So I think hate crimes, first of all, they're very hard to define sometimes, and they're very hard to recognize. And so that's created a lot of the problems. So I think the Biden administration has done something really important with this new legislation, which is going to, for example, establish a position at the Justice Department for reviewing hate crimes and improving reporting. but there's a lot more that can be done and needs to be done, because that, it doesn't really, this legislation doesn't address the fact that we don't have actually at the state level or local level police departments reporting hate crimes whatsoever. They disagree even about what they even exist. But if you look at 1/4 of all major American cities don't report a single hate crime against any group last year. That's, of course, statistically impossible. And 80% of local law enforcement agencies don't report any hate crimes year in, year out. So part of it's definitional, part of it's training, part of it is just simply starting to change the culture. And just to pick up on something Helen said, I think part of it is educational. It's just, we're not taught in our schools much about, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Acts or the Japanese internment. And just one quick story from my own life, when I was Acting Solicitor General, I remember reading in college about the Korematsu case at the Supreme Court, and an account that maybe the government had lied to the Supreme Court about the threat posed by Japanese Americans. And so I went and got the original documents and some other material, and ultimately realized that, yes, the Solicitor General, the Justice Department had lied to the Supreme Court. And so I confessed error on behalf of the department back in 2011. And I remember I wanted to give my first speech in Hawaii about it. And so I did. And there were 500 people from the Japanese American Civil League and other folks. And it was a remarkable audience. And at the end of it, a woman stood up and said, the thing about this is I learned about the Japanese American internment only as a senior in high school. And I remember coming home and telling my mom and saying, Mom, did you know about this? And my mom, she said, got a funny look on her face. And then she said, yes, I was interned. And she hadn't even told her child that. And then other people in the audience raised their hands and said the same thing. There has been a culture of shame around discrimination, of course, as victims. That's a very common thing. But I think if there's any silver lining to come out of the last year, it's that people are now recognizing these incidents aren't atomized. You're not alone. It's part of something systemic. And hopefully we can aid and comfort and ultimately remedy one another.
Yeah, Helen.
Yeah, Neal, I would just like to ask you your thoughts on this point around hate crimes and hate incidents toward Asian Americans. In my observations, I've just concluded that I think there is a higher bar that Asian Americans have to pass when something is considered to even be considered race related. I mean, we saw that in Atlanta where the police sheriff immediately said this has nothing to do with race, when we know that the treatment of Asian American women throughout Asian American history, it was completely consistent with what happened. And, as I was saying in the Vincent Chin case, it's because of you, MFs, we're out of work, does not contain a single racial slur. And when they said, let's get the Chinese, they said, they said Chinese. They didn't say a slur. So there are so many cases that we can point to where, the 3 racial slurs that police or law enforcement on the ground might be familiar with as related to Asian Americans, if they don't hear that, then it's immediately discounted. And so I've concluded that, and I'm wondering from your perspective, just this thing about who's on the ground making the decision about whether something might be related to a hate crime or a protected class or race, and that Asian Americans really are at have a higher bar to pass because people just don't even know anything about us.
Right. So I'll just be very brief and just say, what you're saying accords with my anecdotal experience. I've never seen a study on it, but everything you say sounds exactly reasonable to me. I'd be very interested in Governor Locke's view on that and the more general question.
Yeah, well, let's hop over to the ambassador and then talk some more about hate crimes. I would love to get a big picture view from you, big global picture, and kind of put what's happening in the U.S. into the context of geopolitics. What are you observing about the current treatment of the Asian diaspora and the role that geopolitics, particularly strategic competition with China, is playing in feeding into some of these stereotypes and tensions? Like Helen said, a lot of it just ends up being aimed at Chinese, and we know we're a lot more diverse than that. So, Ambassador, over to you.
Well, I think it really follows from what Helen was talking about. When you look at the history of discrimination and racism against Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans in this country going back into the 1800s, it's always been about finding a scapegoat for the problems that the country is experiencing, whether it was the loss of jobs in the 1800s, and you had the huge number of Chinese immigrants coming over first to bail out the United States because to finish the Transcontinental Railroad, when it was stuck outside the mountains of California, they needed the expertise as well as the bravery and the courage of the Chinese to come in and with their experience in gunpowder and dynamite to finish that. And then they stayed around for the gold mine and the gold rush and the lumber camps and the canneries and just doing some of the menial services for the population. And so there was a backlash. And you look at, again, the Vincent Chin case, as Helen was talking about, and the kind of the economic climate surrounding that, to what's happening now, starting with the Trump administration, basically saying that anything and everything dealing with China is bad, that China is out to ruin the United States, and therefore we have a ban or a huge restriction on the number of Chinese students coming to study in the United States on the theory that, they're all spies. Great scrutiny of Chinese American professors and researchers, whether at the universities or in private companies, to even saying that firms started in America, American companies founded by people of Chinese ancestry, are somehow, these technology firms in Silicon Valley are somehow tied to China, and therefore we need to force divestiture of them, or we cannot do business with them. There's even a whisper campaign among many of the competitors to these high-tech firms founded by Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans. Oh, you don't want to do business with them because, the founder of that company is from China or is Chinese American. They must be spies with China. You can't trust them. Buy from us. Do your business with us, not with them. And then the prosecutions by the Justice Department, which even started under the Obama administration, just, the lack of homework, due diligence. So many people falsely accused, only to be completely exonerated, but by then their lives have been ruined, completely lives ruined. Federal employees, deans of colleges and universities, lives completely ruined. And so with this atmosphere of saying China is our enemy, our competitor, is ingrained into people's. And so, and with the downturn of the economy and everything else, we need to find a scapegoat, someone to blame. COVID-19, China virus, Wuhan virus, Kung Flu virus. So all these messages are reinforcing that Asian Americans, Chinese Americans are foreigners, the perpetual foreigner. And as Helen was indicated, the German cars were fuel efficient, but you don't attack German Americans, because they look like the majority population. But whether you're Black, whether you're Hispanic, whether you're Asian, we are physically different. We stand out. We cannot 100% assimilate. And therefore we're easy targets. And that's why the incidence of hate crimes reported by Stop AAPI Hate, talking about thousands of reported acts of harassment and violence just in the first 6 months or the last 6 months of 2020, right after the pandemic started, to the 1,000 increase in reported or prosecuted crimes by local jurisdictions. I mean, it's one thing to have reports of crime, of violence. It's another thing to catch someone and to prosecute And so to have a huge increase just in prosecutions, including in my hometown of Seattle, means that we have a big problem. We have a big problem. And it's become fashionable, acceptable to exert violence against Chinese Americans. And because as we've all noted, you can't tell, I mean, you know, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, the list goes on, you know, we're indistinguishable, like in Vincent Chin's case. And so it's violence against the AAPI community. And it starts at the top. It starts with the rhetoric from top government officials, embedding that attitude of racism, perpetuating that racism. And it didn't just start with coronavirus and Kung flu virus and Wuhan virus. It started with, hey, during the campaign, we got to keep those Mexicans out, build the border wall because they're nothing but rapists and criminals. Hey, we don't want people from those S-hole countries of Africa. We got to stop immigration. We've got to kick out the foreigners. We need to get tough on China. We need to bring back manufacturing. We need to bring back America as we knew it in the days of Ozzie and Harriet and Father Knows Best and the Partridge Family, or, you know, you name it, the stereotypes of what a white America, racist, white supremacist America was all about, which is why it's really great to see so many organizations, civil rights organizations banding together. This is the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And it has awakened in so many groups the need to be vigilant, to stand up for our civil rights and civil liberties. We need to really recognize that what makes America great is that diversity of people. And we need to be celebrating and acknowledging that diversity instead of denying it and trying to demonize diversity.
I mean, you spoke to the diversity of communities that are coalescing around this time. Obviously, we're talking both through the lens of API violence, as well as the broader conversations about systemic racism and the need for solidarity. And, you know, a lot of people describe this as a moment of inflection, and maybe there were previous moments of inflection that had come and gone, but the conversation today that we're having is how do we take advantage of this moment and then push for real systemic change. Neal, I wonder if you, especially given your legal background, view this as an opportunity for that sort of inflection and fundamental change, and what you see as some of the most critical systemic questions that we're facing that need to be addressed.
Thank you. So I'm still serving as a special prosecutor in the George Floyd cases, so I'm going to be circumspect in what I'll say about, I'm not really talking about that case, but that whole set of cases. And I'm doing that kind of work because I do believe fundamentally discrimination against any group impacts us all. And I've crossed that bridge a few times in my legal work. But, you know, I'm a Hindu, and my first big Supreme Court case was Guantanamo on behalf of folks like accused of being bin Laden's driver and things like that. And more recently, I've been for the Trump administration, I was fighting the Muslim ban. And you remember that Trump campaigned on this idea that, quote, Islam hates us. And he called for a total and complete shutdown of all Muslim immigration to the United States. And I remember my son, we had to, I mean, it was horrible. We had to have, you know, security guards and stuff, and, you know, there were all sorts of threats. My son at one point just asked me, like, why are we doing this, Daddy? Like, what are you fighting for? And I remember I like gave him like this line by line answer about the Immigration and Naturalization Act and, you know, stuff like the First Amendment and stuff, but, you know, it wasn't an answer for a kid. And I remember just soon after he asked me that question, I read a syndicated column by Ann Coulter, of all people. It just showed up in my Google alerts. And she said the following. She said, you know, quote, arguing against Trump was first generation American Neal Katyal. There are plenty of 10th generation America haters. You couldn't get one of them to argue that we should end our country through mass immigration. End our country through mass immigration. And I remember being so angry when I read her words, because I rebel against this idea that being a first generation American would disqualify me, or the idea that mass immigration would end the country instead of being the rock on which the country was built. And, here I think Gary's absolutely right. We need to flip the lens. I mean, Ann Coulter, those people think that being the child of an immigrant is a weakness, but she was wrong. To me, it's my superpower. It's my strength, because I knew from a young age what America was supposed to stand for, why our parents came here. And that is so powerful. And we need to harness that fundamental insight, which all of us have and our parents have, and prior generations and people in other countries teach us, and push to make this country a better place.
Thanks for sharing.
Except for the Native Americans and the indigenous tribes of America, we're all foreigners, whether we're first generation or 10th generation, whether our parents came here on the Mayflower, or ancestors came on a Mayflower or a slave ship from Africa or a steamer from China or Asia. And look at Trump. His own wife is an immigrant, and she brought her parents over recently. And then, of course, Trump then turned around and tried to stop family reunifications after Melania was able to get her family over. I mean, we are all foreigners. We are all foreigners. And I would suspect that if one did a study, that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of Americans are probably less than third generation or fourth generation immigrants. And so we come from all parts of the world, and it's that constant infusion of different ideas and values and customs and perspectives that has really fueled the innovation, the dynamism, the energy of America.
And if we could only send a picture of Wong Kim Arc to every one of those people who want to make America white again and say, you can thank this Asian American for the fact that you are an American. And I only wish I had known that when I was a kid, when people said, go back where you came from. And I could say, you go back where you came from, because the only reason you are here is because of an Asian American who established birthright citizenship.
Yeah, Helen, give us a brief overview of that case, and also tell us about whether these cases and the history of our community is being adequately taught, not only in K through 12, but even in higher education.
Well, Michelle, you just asked me to do something in front of these two very distinguished attorneys, but I will just say about Wong Kim Arc was that he was a Chinese man who was born in America, who left the country for a brief period in the 1800s and returned, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was there, and who was barred from re-entering. And he said, no, I was born here. And he and the Chinese American community took a case all the way to the Supreme Court to fight the barring of him. And he won. The Asian American community won. And what was established by the Supreme Court in 1898 was to say birthright citizenship for Americans. And so everybody who's ever come through Ellis Island or can trace that, what Gary was saying, people who, couldn't even think of their grandparents as being immigrants, it's because of Wong Kim Arc that treasured American citizenship was bestowed, because you had the fortune to be born here. But there are many, many cases like that, many situations where Asian Americans have stood up and fought the kind of things that have been imposed on our communities. But it's something I call MIH, missing in history. So the great benefits to all people, all Americans, that Asian Americans have been part of fighting for, are sort of missing there. And then people can say, oh, where did you all come from? Where did this hate crime or mass killing happen? And I didn't even know you Asians were here. And in fact, they may have benefited to be American thanks to Asian Americans. And, we were talking about hate crimes, bills, which I agree are very complicated in how they're applied, because in the Vincent Chin case, we ran into that over and over again. And the questions we had to surmount when we were saying, hey, an injustice was done, we should have a civil rights investigation here. The first things we had to overcome was, well, he's Chinese, he's a Chinese American. Are Asian Americans protected by US civil rights law? that was actually discussed. It was debated. And some organizations like the Michigan chapter of the ACLU and the National Lawyers Guild Michigan chapter and other constitutional law professors said Asians should not be protected by federal civil rights law. And so that was something we fought for, as well as for hate crimes protections overall for other groups. And so, so there are many ways our history is just sort of missing, and how our communities have worked to really make an impact on all communities. Another thing I just want to say of the Vincent Chin case was victim impact statements. Vincent Chin's family was denied the possibility of standing up in court to say, my son's life mattered. And so out of that, it became part of a victims impact statement movement. And so we see how the Me Too movement has made incredibly effective use of the rights of women to stand up in court to say, this is how what you did to me harmed me. But that was something that the Asian American community was part of also fighting for, that has had a huge impact on all Americans. And yet, if these things go missing in history, you know, we continue to be seen as the perpetual foreigner, the evil invader, bent on destroying America, as Gary was saying.
Well, and also point out when Helen talks about MIH, missing in history, and the fact that Vincent Chin was not even, you know, it was being debated as whether or not it was even a hate crime and even a protected class. It really feeds into this myth of the model minority, in which all Asian Americans are somehow lumped in and stereotyped as being very, very successful. And in some ways, elements of the Asian American AAPI community have also bought into that notion of the model minority. And that, and you see this huge debate, especially among more recent immigrants, and especially among Chinese Americans, saying, well, there's no need for affirmative action. We should all oppose affirmative action because look how successful some of us are. Well, I think that certainly the violence over the last year and you know, the scapegoating of Chinese Americans and therefore by extension Asian Americans over the coronavirus has exposed the fact that we still are subjected to racism. And in fact, sometimes, you know, trying to label us the model minority as a way to separate us away from solidarity with other racial groups and ethnic groups and fighting for civil rights and civil liberties, which is why it's so gratifying to see so many Asian American AAPI organizations forming solidarity with other racial groups, so the NAACP, the Anti-Defamation League, and really speaking out saying, hey, this racism and discrimination against one group actually impacts everybody. And to see other groups coming to the defense and indicating solidarity and support for AAPI community.
Yeah, and you know, I would also add that it's been especially important for members of the media to be aware of this long history and the interwoven activism and history of our communities, because so speaking with my AAJA hat, we are a nonprofit that represents journalists all over the country and in Asia, and they are oftentimes the only ones in their newsroom pushing for these stories to be told, even if their beat isn't to cover race or AAPIs. We're so underrepresented in the newsroom, especially in news leadership, that sometimes it's the lowest ranking person in the newsroom trying to ask for one story about an Asian hate incident or violent incident to be covered. And then they're facing all these questions from their newsroom saying like, well, are you sure it's actually happening? How do you know it's a trend? Is this actually a hate crime? You know, I think these are these sorts of conversations are happening all throughout the many different parts of society. So I want to get into systemic change and solutions, right? So not only this panel, but the entire audience here is highly educated, you know, highly involved individuals. And so let's talk about what systemic change looks like and should look like. Because every time there's a crisis, we talk about how things need to change. But right now, it seems like the conversation is, okay, let's see that change. So I'd like to pose a question to each of the panelists. So for all of you to answer, what are the ways to actually promote change in a systemic level, on an individual basis, as a group, organization, government, whatever it is? And what do we need to do moving forward to actually push for real change? What would you, given all the minds that are on this call, what would you want to make a case for to see the type of change that we need to see now? We'll go from Neal, Gary, and then Helen, and then open up for Q&A.
I think that this bridge concept is a really important one that we need to recognize as Asian Americans, that we share a lot of commonality with other marginalized groups, and hopefully they'll recognize that about us. Like, I'm struck that when I go to London, there's actually a bit more discrimination you can feel just palpably on the street. In the UK, formally considered Black. The founder of the Black Lawyers Association was a Hindu. And it's remarkable that just by jumping on a plane, you can start to experience some of these subtle changes. So I think just a kind of greater appreciation from within, without, about the commonalities is important. At the same time, right now, that's not where we are. Asians often get left behind in discussions. I mean, just look at the Biden cabinet, for example. We don't have a Governor Locke in the cabinet. And that to me is, a step backwards. And so representation matters. I am dismayed by by the Biden administration's progress in this area. And I think it matters because, look, if President Obama hadn't put me in that position, I'm not sure I'd be here on this panel today. So these things have long tails and long consequences. Every appointment you make, every slot. And, sometimes we get left behind in that.
Governor Locke.
I'd like to just, build on what Neal was saying. Not only do we need representation in all ranks of government and certainly the executive branch, having given our blood, sweat, and tears for this country all through the centuries, we have every right, indeed a responsibility, to be at the table helping set the policies that affect all of our communities and to bring our perspectives and to help, shape better policies. Whether at the school board level, the city council level, the state legislative level, or the United States Congress, and certainly in the executive branch. So I guess I would really urge more AAPIs to run for office and to be involved in government, to bring our unique perspectives to the table. I would also say that we need to be more vigilant and more vocal and outraged, and to form alliances with other civil rights organizations and other ethnic groups that are fighting for civil rights and civil liberties, because this, the myth of the model minority was reflective of a certain period of time. But as Helen says, these things go back centuries, and we will always, I think, unfortunately, be treated as perpetual foreigners, unless we are really active and constantly vigilant and protective of our rights. We deserve to protect our rights because we've given our blood, sweat, and tears for this country.
Helen.
So I agree wholeheartedly with both Neal and Gary on the points of representation and speaking up. And I guess I would carry that in another way to say that what each of us can do is and must do is fight the invisibility that has been burying our communities, making us seen by others as either the perpetual foreigner or the model minority, both of which are used to damage our communities and even more to damage all of other Americans too. And it's a way of being manipulated. And I'm very aware that we're speaking to a group of people. We ourselves have had privileged educations, but this whole audience, and so I know many people, former classmates, friends who have said, what's wrong with being the model? And so, or this thing about being, honorary white people, white adjacent or whatever, if we just keep our heads down and say nothing, maybe we can sneak under the radar. But hello, a year and a half has gone by, and it's very clear that no matter what social class or background, you are, or what profession, the targeting could be you or your families. And so your question about inflection point, the door is open. People are waking up. Our communities are waking up and saying, well, okay, maybe I saw an article yesterday about Asian Americans in banking are coming together and speaking up. In the finance field, which is an area where people have often thought they can just go there and sort of work hard and make money. But one of the quotes was, we're all being lumped together and treated as a monolith, so we may as well come together and speak up. Well, that is really what it's going to take. And whether that's wherever we work, our communities, wherever we practice our faith, or our K through 12 or preschool age education, or our higher eds, it is outrageous that some of our Ivy League and elite universities now are still questioning the value of Asian American studies. If we don't have the visibility of what truly has happened in the past, who is going to know this, including our own communities, our own children, the next generation, to have any idea of what contributions and battles that our communities have fought for our right to be here and for other Americans. And if we don't have that, then we can't empower the people who do get into positions to represent us, or to the journalists who are there fighting to have these stories told. So it really does start with every one of us taking the positions that we have, doing something with it, and taking this moment and making it more than a moment, and really making change. Because Gary was talking about the situation with China. That's not going anywhere. That is probably going to get worse, right? We have a rising superpower and a struggling, well, maybe not American exceptionalism, but most Americans, when they're asked what is the existential threat to America, they say China. And then that gets underscored by politicians who are trying to score points. And so unfortunately, this time we are in, I frankly don't see it disappearing anytime soon, as far as this genie of anti-Asian hate that's been unleashed and is global. It is not just restricted to North America. It is global. Every continent except for Antarctica has reported violent attacks against Asian-looking people. And so it's going to take all of us, and those of us who have had the opportunities of education to do something with it, we have to do it wherever we are, to speak up. There is no more silence. Being silent today is being part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Neal, you talked earlier about the lack of representation under the administration and the need for essentially pipelines of people following up in the footsteps of people who have carved spaces for the next generation. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the ways that alumni and networks can support each other and their communities, especially in making sure that there is greater representation in all the systems that govern the country.
I mean, it's huge. And I'm struck by this all the time, like that, I'm not a networker person at all. Like I was never good at that. And yet I still see, who gives me work, who hires me, who promotes me, tends to be people who, I've encountered in some sort of event around diversity in one way or another, not necessarily Asian Americans, but just someone who's experienced some of the same things I have. It's a remarkable, persistent fact. And I do think that, that there's a lot that alumni can do. There's a question in the chat right now in which someone points out that Dartmouth doesn't have an Asian American Studies department, which is a shame, I think. At the same time, I'd say that, they have had professors who teach that. Indeed, when that whole Korematsu story I was talking about, the Japanese American internment, was because of a professor in college who mentioned it to me. And so even the little lessons, even if we don't have the big success we ultimately want, we don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good. You know, even incremental success matters quite a bit in this area, particularly when we have so much ground to cover. We're starting at such a low point. The good thing is that, you know, that because of diminishing returns, we've got, you know, maximal returns on our side. And so, you know, I think it's incumbent on all of us, which I feel badly about. You know, we already have a lot to do, but it is incumbent on us who've graduated to mentor the next generation and them to do so for the next one.
Yeah, and I just saw in the chat that neither does Stanford have the program either.
And there are no Asians at Stanford. Don't worry about
it. Well, you know, actually, speaking of representation and fighting invisibility, I'd like to make a plug for AAJ Studio, which is the speakers bureau that that AAJ runs. Essentially, the theory of that is we want to give media outlets no excuse of leaving Asians out of any news stories or news coverage. So especially because there are so many professionals on this call, we're looking for experts who want to become sources in the media, who want to be covered and want to speak and interject your voice into news coverage, and not just on Asian issues. You know, there are tax experts, medical experts, activists, authors, all sorts of people who also happen to be Asian and who deserve a voice in media coverage. And I think Joyce might have put, oh, Sarah just added the link, it's aajstudio.org. We're looking for more professionals to add into AAJ Studio to make sure that bookers and editors and reporters all have sources that they could cover. So if you're interested, please nominate yourself, nominate your colleagues and friends so that we can all be a part of raising that visibility of AAPI professionals. Well, we have a lot of questions already, but how about each speaker will do a brief, just some final thoughts, just based on what we've talked about so far. If you haven't gotten to something from earlier that someone else said, this is a time to kind of address that, maybe close some final thoughts that you meant to say earlier. Gary, do you want to go first? And then we'll do Helen and then Neal.
Well, I just think that it's important that we continue to emphasize the history, what Helen called the missing in history, because if you know, if we ourselves don't understand the struggles and the contributions of the AAPI community in America, how can we influence others? And so we need to make sure that the general public is aware of the discrimination and the hardships exacted against and suffered by and experienced by the AAPI community. So I guess my one thing is, despite and in addition to the activism and the vigilance of the moment now, we need to make sure that to try to impress upon all of America the truth about the history of its treatment toward AAPIs. We've got to have that history mentioned. It's got to be in the textbooks. It's got to be before your senior year in high school or a casual reference or mention by a professor in college. It has to really start at a much earlier age.
Helen.
Yeah, that is also true, and what we need to have done, and we have a lot of people on this Zoom that are in positions to be able to raise your voices. And I guess I would just add that where we are today is part of that history, recent history, is we've been living through, I think, at least 4 decades of very intensive, well-funded research and policies used to divide us. And for Asian Americans, that includes being used, this whole model minority thing, a racist myth, to use Asian Americans to be pitted against other communities of color. If we're the good minority, well, who's the bad minority? And that is a framing that has now for at least 40 years or more been embedded in the American consciousness and even absorbed by our own community members. And what that does is it helps create those divisions that keep our communities apart. And if we can just imagine the communities that we represent, alumni communities, however we see our own communities, and extend that to other communities of color, other communities of conscience, of people who really want to make change and turn back from this time of division and fear of insurrection in the capital, and really build a society that every human being is respected for their full humanity and their full human dignity. If that's something which seems pretty basic, that we can all find each other to work together with, other alumni groups, of different affinity groups together, we could make huge change. We could make big change tomorrow. And so I would like to just leave that. Don't fall into the mindset of the divisions. A University of Michigan study just came out the other day saying that this idea that the anti-Asian hate is being committed by Black people against Asians. Yes, there are incidents that have gone viral, but the vast majority of attacks that have been reported where the perpetrator's race can be identified has been white males. And so we don't see, viral videos of white men harassing Asian American school children, which is happening on a widespread basis. So I would just say, let's try to, unlearn the poison that gets fed to us and learn about what's really happening. That includes our history, but the facts, and try to think of a world where we come together and really make change together.
I would say, just picking up on something Helen said about the model minority point, I think that resonated with me a lot. I'm Yale's lawyer in all their affirmative action challenges, so I'm not speaking about that case, but I've seen in a lot of these cases, Asian Americans are used as a kind of wedge. They're the plaintiffs to, basically divide and conquer the various minorities and the admissions policies, which is incredibly unfortunate. I think one thing that we have to do is overcome our resistance to talking about our experiences. I mean, I saw so many times with my parents growing up, something horrible would happen and they would just swallow it. They would laugh. They pretend it didn't happen. And I feel like even in my life, I try and do that too sometimes. By swallowing all that, we eliminate the tapestry of experiences that we all share, and it becomes harder to coalesce and recognize, because those smaller incidents ultimately culminate in bigger ones and much more unfortunate ones. And so I think that there's something that has to be done there. And it's particularly so because I think over the last 4 years, and this is just to pick up on a point Gary made, I think we've seen a president who really tried to foment a lot of hatred of Asian Americans and particularly Chinese Americans. I mean, he wanted to make racism great again. And we have to create our own set of resilient defenses to that happening again, because it's going to happen again.
So that actually leads into our first question from the audience, which is, how can the Biden administration help people in the US who think in racist terms to distinguish between the government policies of a country and the people in the US that are the diaspora from that country? For example, that the Chinese government has made humanitarian violations. So I guess this is getting to that question of what can the system do to refute some of those characteristics that are being made to tie the diaspora with the government and political leadership of a different country. Neal, do you want to take that on?
No, that's
Okay.
not something I know.
Gary
would be great.
Yeah, Gary would be good for that.
I think it just starts with words from the top. And President Biden has been fairly eloquent and frequently talking about this and speaking out against the Asian hate that we've seen in this country. And yes, you could have, we just need to make sure that government officials keep sending that message out, whether it's the mayors, the governors, city council members, members of Congress, that yes, we have issues with China's economic and trade policy, human rights policy. We have big differences with the government policies of China, but we celebrate and have no quarrel with the people of China, and certainly Asian Americans and Chinese Americans, just as we have always had differences with some of the policies of Israel or France or Germany, but we don't vilify the people, the Jewish community, the people of German Americans and of German ancestry. So those words have to be coming out from the top.
Helen, I want to ask you this question from the audience, which is, I'm finding it difficult to find opportunities for individual activism. And I'm wondering, as a part of that, if you can also talk about some of the reckoning that has been going on within our own AAPI community, especially with the history of anti-Blackness among some people in the community. When people ask about individual activism, that's the kind of reckoning that comes to mind for me, because I think it's sometimes difficult to talk about those things or even recognize it, and then even to think about how to rectify it. Helen, what are your thoughts on how individuals can take can make decisions and make change?
Sure. I would say that the actions and activism is really just about taking action, is limited only by the amount of energy and time and imagination that you have. And so I would really encourage the questioner to look at whatever region of the country they're in and find some of the organizations. And if you're having trouble with that, send me something. You can find me on social media, and I'll because I know there is a huge network of Asian American advocacy groups, Asian American volunteer groups. They might not call themselves activists, but they don't need to be. If they're trying to improve the lives of our communities, if they're trying to get their school superintendent or their school board to do something to ensure the safety of the kids as they are beginning to, return to school, those are all activist things. Getting involved in, electoral politics, supporting candidates who listen and recognize that an Asian American community exists and uplifts, all voices. I mean, those are all activist things, and there are many organizations. So what I would just say, that's really only limited by what you would like to do, because there is a huge range of volunteerism and support and things like that everyone on this Zoom can do. And that could be a small individual act, sending out emails to your elected officials, letting them know you support the hate crimes protection bill that was just voted on, and applaud them if they voted for it. And supporting, what Gary and Neal were just talking about, having a example set at the top. Encourage that to happen. Support the reporters who are, fighting the effort in the newsroom to get a story told. And if they get it on the news, send it to the general manager and say, hey, that was really good. You should have more of that. All of those are actions. That's part of activism. But if you really want to get down and into the, out there are plenty of groups that are also leading protests and doing things like that. Many of them are on social media. And so I'm happy to help anybody with that. But please, I'm sure AAJA has a whole list of organizations out there too. So and your alumni groups, fighting for Asian American studies there too. That is activism. So
and it could be very simple acts, such as here in Seattle, we had a group of AAPI executive directors of nonprofits banding together to meet with the mayor and say, hey, your mass vaccination program and mass vaccination site is not really helpful and clear to especially elderly of limited English speaking abilities. And so that was an activism where they came together to really impress upon them the need for services, vaccinations of the virus, that could really in a way that would made it simple, convenient, and understandable for a limited English-speaking populations. It doesn't have to be big projects. It all just get active. Pick something that you care about.
So I'm going to toss really quickly to Neal because he has to hop off. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, first of all, just thank you all, and sorry to leave early, but Michelle, your newspaper just reported on the Trump grand jury stuff, which is my specialty, so I have to get on air. But I want to thank everyone, and I particularly want to thank Helen's brother Hoyt, who I think had the initial idea to put this together, and it was an extraordinary discussion. So continue, please, without me. Thank you so much for including me as part of it.
Thank you.
You, Neal.
Well, we have so many more questions, so let's continue. Okay. So one question we have is, it actually gets to something you've both talked about, which is, do you have any advice on how Asian Americans can flip the script regarding the model minority myth, particularly when members of our own community buy into it? And I think this is such an important question and so deeply rooted in a lot of the narratives that we buy into ourselves. I would love both of you to address this, Gary and then Helen.
Well, I think that we simply need to impress upon the members of our own community the history of the struggles of the discrimination, the racism that we have faced. I'm hopeful that at least the last year of all the violence against AAPI will awaken those who believe that we are the model minority, that we have somehow arrived and that we don't need to be active, that this will have destroyed that myth. Or certainly poked a big hole in it, because I really think that white supremacy is really trying to push that narrative of the model minority to keep us from advocating for our own interests and protection of our community. It is also a way in which it's being used as a tool to suppress other ethnic and racial groups, saying, why aren't you like that model minority? And therefore, as Helen was saying, you're the bad minority, keep quiet. Why can't you be silent and work within the system, et cetera, or be as satisfied as that other group? So I really think we're being victimized in some ways. And unfortunately, members of the AAPI community have bought into that. That's why you see the division on affirmative action and admissions to colleges, universities, and things like that, or just any type of affirmative action, not recognizing that the Yales and the Harvards and the Princetons and the Dartmouths of the world are so much more diverse because of affirmative action years ago. I mean, I'm a product of affirmative action. I mean, when I entered into Yale as an undergrad, I was one of maybe just a handful of people, virtually no African-American Black students. And Yale at that time wanted students from the West Coast. They wanted more students from the public schools, and they wanted more students of color. So I was a threefer, but I still had to take the same exams, still write the same papers as anyone else. And it turns out that, yeah, I didn't have a perfect SAT score, but when you compare it to even the white students that were admitted, I was not at the very bottom, I was in the middle. And so I really think that members of our own community need to understand the struggles and that our progress is episodic, but it's built on the trailblazing efforts of many other people, and we cannot forget those struggles, whether Japanese Americans being interned during World War II, to members, trailblazers being elected to city councils, or even to the Congress, people like Norm Matsui and Norma Netta, and then now you have Mazie Hirano and Tammy Duckworth and so many others. My success was because of the trailblazing efforts of so many other people, and I cannot ever thank those trailblazers enough for breaking the bamboo ceiling, the glass ceiling, and enabling me to have a chance.
Yeah, and in addition to everything that Gary just said, the thing about the model minority is if we look at this group and people think, well, I've done well, I had an education, I'm in a profession, so the model minority racist myth must be true. But in fact, this is where just using a little bit of that education that we all have benefited from to say, let's drill down a little bit further. You know, we should talk about disaggregating the data, because we know that all Asian Americans are not the same. And if we actually insist on, for example, our alma maters, not just count all Asian students, which they also put in the international Asian students there too, to pump up the numbers, right, of how many students of color they have there. That's something that's often done. But if they actually disaggregate according to different Asian ethnicities, it becomes very clear that there may be dominant groups of students that are recruited, that people end up accepting the same Asian groups over and over again and neglecting other, really then becoming very overlooked Asian American groups who are, just underrepresented, might come from communities where there's a high level of poverty and are first-time college-bound students. We have that within our communities. And if we just actually begin to look at further breakdowns beyond this idea that we are this monolithic model minority, we should be able to decipher that and just say, you know what, that's really not true. My own mother didn't graduate beyond the 3rd grade. And if you look at the statistics, there are very high numbers of Asian Americans who do not go beyond high school. There is a very large poverty rate in the Asian American community. In fact, I saw a statistic that in New York City, the racial group that had the highest level of poverty was Asian Americans. Now, where is our community on that? If we as college graduates and more don't pay attention to that and talk about that and find ways to lift up those stories and those communities, then we're only adding to the whole notion that, hey, I'm doing okay, so everybody who is an Asian American must be doing okay. And that's simply not true. So, on one level, we should be insisting that our universities, our alma maters, break down the data. Don't just throw all Asians and Asian Americans together. Let's see what communities are missing in our schools and try to really recruit in, those communities. So, and do something to uplift that. That's something we can all on this call do. And then with the census, with other institutions, yes, we really need disaggregation so we can show, that there are very vulnerable communities within our Asian American umbrella that really need more attention. And we should be giving that attention to it too.
Right. I think the socioeconomic diversity of the AAPI community is not talked about enough. All you have to do, like you said, is look into the data, and you can just see the vast differences in income levels, education levels within the AAPI community, which sometimes feels like such a flattening term, because how do you describe a community of 50 ethnicities and even many, many more languages and dialects, and I think making sure that you assert that narrative of that diversity within the community so that the experiences are not collapsed into one is a big part of, making sure people see the nuances of the community. Another question is, how can we build up and strengthen AAPI communities to speak out against hate, especially since it's so commonplace to keep our heads down and just bear it? I think that's also one of those narratives that sometimes we take on for ourselves, that when you're an immigrant or a child of an immigrant, you just keep your head down, you do your best, and your best work will shine. And if you witness hate, then you just don't really talk about it. But those sorts of concepts are also now being challenged, especially given the cases we've seen across the country. What are both of your thoughts on how to break out against that sort of narrative placed on the community, and then how to build a collective voice or strength within the community? And we'll go the opposite way this time, Helen, and then Gary.
I just think if each of us thought about, would we raise our voices if we were seeing something happen to our parents, our grandparents, walking down the street and something was potentially dangerous, or our children on the way to school? Would we not raise our voices and speak up? Yes, I think we would, right? And so if we could extend that to the idea that, this is our community, this is our beloved community, our extended family. And I think where some of that narrative comes from, Michelle, you're right, some of it is coming from the fact that people, especially the immigrant generation, this is a new society to them. I know for, my last book was about people who left China as exiles and refugees and came to America. And for many of them, they felt like they were just grateful to be here and felt like a guest. But you know what? For the 1.X generations and then the other generations that have been there, we don't have that. We have the, we are born here. We grew up eating hot dogs and apple pie and all of that stuff, right? So what I tend to hear sometimes is, well, aren't Asian Americans, isn't it cultural? Isn't it cultural that we just sort of keep our heads down? That's part of being Asian in America. Well, you know what? If we look at Asia and we look at the kind of protests that go on there daily in, you tell me, whatever country it is, and even in totalitarian countries like China, you know what? There are underground movements that are going on. But you look at Hong Kong, you look at Myanmar, you look at any one of these countries, people are spilling blood in Congress, in their equivalent to, their legislatures. And so it's not cultural coming from Asia or the Pacific that people arrived here being silent. What happens is when you arrive in a place that enforces silence upon you either through an overall culture that says you are always going to be a foreigner, and if you don't learn to toe the line, we will intern you and incarcerate you, just like we did Japanese Americans during World War II, and that conversation continues to say, well, should we intern and incarcerate Chinese Americans or Muslim Americans today? So it's not that just happened during World War II, it's still an ongoing conversation. Or being the quote model minority, that is another way of enforcing silence upon our communities. If you be quiet, we will throw you a few crumbs, and then you can consider yourself almost acceptable. Those things have been ways of a culture to create silence in our communities. And so, that's what I say when people say, shouldn't we just try to plod along? And you know what, like an ostrich, if you stick your head in the sand, the whole back end is still up there. And what we see for Asian Americans now, you walk down the street and no matter how you might think that you've made it to some level, there are people out there who we know see us as, the enemy or as somebody to blame. And so the time of being quiet and thinking that, keep our heads down and in the sand, that train has passed. So this is the time, if we really want to improve the lives of our communities, our families, and the generations to come, this is the time where we must speak up.
I recently was talking with someone about that concept of an immigrant tax, that the tax you pay because you got to immigrate here was that you just don't create trouble. But I think the conversation now is, how far has that gotten the community? How much change has that created? Gary, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that in some ways the reluctance by some of our elders to get engaged is because of their own experiences. They came here as an immigrant, and I remember growing up, we'd have these Chinese New Year banquets and community banquets, and the family associations would invite the immigration officer. They were always at the banquets because there was a fear that somehow, hey, we could, some of our elders and immigrants who don't have U.S. citizenship yet, permanent residency, green card, might get shipped back. So you got to keep those good relationships with those government officials. And so there was this tendency not to rock the boat out of self-interest. But those of us who are more enlightened now and understand that we're American citizens born here, or we have that citizenship, we need to speak out. And I think that, for individuals, there may be a kind of ignorance as well, or a feeling, well, I don't know how to just protest, or what should I do? I'm outraged. I want to do something. That's where I think leaders of different community organizations need to step up. Even if it's a small group, organize a rally. I have to say that after the Atlanta massacres, it was just, and then even before that, it was just so amazing to see all these AAPI groups, including immigrant groups, and even groups that have, opposed affirmative action and said we are the model minority and we need to be quiet. They were the ones organizing the rallies, and from those rallies, hundreds, almost 1,000 people attended. It was so heartwarming to see this group of individuals that I've come across in the Seattle area who I have, perceived as being relatively quiet, not involved in civic affairs or government affairs and things like that, getting very angry and agitated, and even came out in the pouring rain. So I think that there is an interest there, an awakening, but it's going to require the leadership of many of our organizations, whether nonprofit, whether it's community-based, whether political activist groups, to create those moments, and people will respond.
Yeah, speaking of those, that budding activism, I spent about 10 days in Atlanta after the shooting, just reporting on the community and the response and the grief. And one of the most striking changes to come out of that in that moment was the newfound activism of the first generation Koreans in Atlanta. The people who weren't typically involved in activism or any sort of conversations about racial change at all, or racial justice or social change. And that was something that the community members themselves were really talking about, which is that even though it wasn't a part of that first generation community, they're really stepping up now. And they also showed up in the pouring rain for a candlelight vigil. We already talked about the socioeconomic diversity, but I want to kind of ask a different aspect of socioeconomics within the AAPI community, which is that there are people with the financial resources to help fund change. So what can people do who have the financial means to donate, to support groups, or even, for everything from nonprofits to maybe even politics or any groups that are working towards systemic change? How can AAPIs be financially involved in creating that? And maybe Helen, you want to take that on, and some of the activism that you see woefully underfunded?
Sure. There are so many grassroots, what we call grassroots organizations that are doing, community level organizing and activism. And it may be, youth, millennials who are forming organizations and haven't yet created their own infrastructure to have a contribution or donation stream happening. Well, you might want to, these are very underfunded groups. And actually, with the invisibility of the Asian American community, there's data by a group called Asian Americans in Philanthropy, APIP, that have documented over time that the Asian American community gets a minuscule percentage of the overall foundation and donation money that's out there. So whatever people who have the means to give a little bit of money, and even $10, $20, $50 to some of these organizations, really is essential. And, what often happens too is that people, they might have a pet project, or they might go to an organization that is very well known, but may already be pretty well funded compared to others. So if we want to think about what are the vulnerable sectors of our communities, youth groups, women's groups, LGBTQ organizations, groups like that don't make it necessarily onto the news. They're not called on to be, expert or speakers, but they're doing real work, reaching really important parts of our community. More relatively recent refugee groups, and, we really do have poverty within our communities. How do we address that? We have homelessness within our Asian American communities. So the range of what you can do with whatever resources you have. You know, do a little bit of research. If you want to have that impact locally, look it up. Find somebody that you know who is involved in the community, who has a knowledge of the lay of the landscape of what groups could really use your help. That's where this group on this Zoom could really make a difference too, because our community organizations are woefully underfunded.
And
I
Gary-
would really second that. I mean, there is an organization that was recently formed, the Asian American Foundation. The acronym is TAAF. And, you know, they've got people like Jerry Yang of Yahoo and Eric Yuan of Google and so many others that are raising and have pledged $1 billion to really help publicize the plight and the history and the struggles and the contributions of AAPIs in America. And I think they're also going to be doing some political activism as well. But each of us can really make a big difference with our time and our money. And it doesn't have to be big. As Helen said, we have so many in everyone's own communities. There are all these different organizations, whether it's focusing on youth, whether it's focusing on the elderly or the refugees, and helping them provide the services will really benefit our community. And those organizations also have contacts with government leaders. And so the stronger those organizations are, the more clout that they have in relaying the concerns or the needs of our community, and making sure that the government officials are responsive to the needs of those communities and those particular issues, whether it's on senior health, whether it's on food banks, and whether it's on language barriers, et cetera, et cetera. So I would urge people, look at your own community, see what you can do there, because that's where you can make a real immediate, concrete difference.
And Gary, building on that, what do you see as the opportunities for political influence building for the API community?
Well, I think you saw it in this last presidential election where the AAPI community really turned out. They were a part of the difference in the Georgia U.S. Senate races. They are a much larger voting bloc. Politicians are beginning to pay more attention to the voting power of the AAPI community. And so we need to continue that effort of more organizing, registering people to vote, and making sure they actually turn out to vote. And because when politicians understand that a certain group of individuals were key or pivotal to their electoral success, they're going to be much more responsive and have open doors to community leaders from that group, meeting with them and to hear of the concerns of the community. So we got to be politically involved. There are many organizations that are, political organizations that donate money and focus the money on specific candidates that can make a big difference instead of spreading all of our funds, all across the board, but really concentrating on certain candidates and also just elevating and encouraging more AAPI candidates to run. So I really think that when you look at, the population of the state of California or cities like San Francisco, why is it that, or New York City, why do we have, especially in New York, I would imagine, why do we have such a disproportionate lack of representation in political office? So I really think that, having given our blood, sweat, and tears for this country, we have a responsibility to be at the table. And I would encourage more people to run for office.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up this conversation with that call to action. I want to thank all of our panelists, Helen Zia, Ambassador Gary Locke, Neal Katyal. Thank you so much for your time and insight, and also to Hoyt Zia for having the initial idea for this conversation. I'm really grateful for your time. I also want to thank the organizations that have been involved and have co-sponsored, including Stop Repeating History, the Dartmouth Asian Pacific American Alumni Association, Dartmouth Alumni Relations, and the co-sponsors from Dartmouth affiliated groups, Dartmouth Consortium of Studies in Race, Migration, and Sexuality, co-sponsors from Brown, Cornell, Duke, Harvard, Penn, Princeton, Stanford, and Yale. And thank you to everyone who attended and asked questions and were engaged throughout the conversation. It's been great to have that conversation happening on chat. And I hope you all have a safe and wonderful evening. And please stay in touch if you want to join AAJA or get involved in AAJA or have questions about it. We're at aaj.org.
And Michelle, thank
Michelle.
you.
Thank you, and good luck to you. And
master.
congratulations on your post to Japan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Open to all story ideas.
All right.